This is 9/11 Freefall.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another episode of 9/11 Freefall. My name is Andy Steele, and I am the host. Tonight, we're going to be joined by civil engineer and AE 9/11 Truth board member Roland Angle and Dr. Oswald Rendon-Herrero, a civil engineer with a very distinguished career. He'll be talking about that tonight. We'll also be talking about a presentation that Roland recently did at the Mississippi-Alabama Engineering Society meeting where he presented the World Trade Center evidence to the engineers there. Had a very good response. So we'll be getting into all of that tonight in the interview. It's a long one, so we're going to be jumping right into it. I'm going to be playing that for you in just a few moments.
The views expressed on this show by guests and the host on issues outside of the 9/11 controlled demolition evidence are the opinions of those individuals alone and do not necessarily reflect those of architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth.
All right, I have two great guests today. First one is Dr. Oswald Rendon-Herrero. Dr. Rendon is a civil engineer in Starksville, Mississippi, where he specializes in failure analysis of building foundations and other soil-related infrastructure and reconstruction of construction accidents. He has about 30 years of experience providing litigation support and expert witness testimony in Mississippi. He's worked on over 50 cases with attorneys in that state. He's a control member of the Technical Council on Forensic Engineering, which is part of the American Society of Civil Engineers, and he was associate editor of the Journal of Performance of Constructed Facilities. He's joined today by Roland Angle. Roland is a graduate from the University of California, Berkeley, with a BS in Civil Engineering. He served in the U.S. Army Special Forces, where he was trained in the use of explosives and became a licensed civil engineer in California. His 50 years of engineering experience has included designing and testing of blast-hardened missile launch facilities and designing U.S. naval explosive containers, harbor terminal facilities, earth foundation systems, and hydraulic systems. In addition, Roland has owned 3 construction companies and has taught engineering subjects to high school students. He's currently on the board of AE 9/11 Truth. He's now given presentations for AE. We're going to be talking about one that he gave recently, but first I just want to say, guys, welcome to 9/11 Freefall.
Yes,
thanks for having us, Andy.
Now, before we get into the presentation that Roland gave and that which Dr. Rendon was largely responsible for making happen, I want our audience to know more about our guests. We've had Roland on in the past, but this is Dr. Rendon's first time here. So, Dr. Rendon, tell us more about your background.
Well, I started as a technician back in 1957 with an associate degree in construction technology. Then went on to get a bachelor's degree at Clarkson University in Potsdam, New York. And about 2 years later, I went and obtained a master's of science degree in civil engineering at Clarkson University. And eventually, in 1970, went to Virginia Polytechnic Institute, where I obtained my doctorate in civil engineering. And that's my education. I have worked in various positions since 1957. In the technician position, I did work all over Puerto Rico, primarily doing soil borings, taking samples and making studies at different sites for different types of constructed facilities. Then after I obtained my doctorate, I started teaching at the University of Buffalo at SUNY, that's State University of New York at Buffalo. I taught there for about 5 years, and then went on to Mississippi State University and taught there until I retired in 2004 as a full professor and emeritus professor. During that time, from 1967 onward, I worked as a civil engineer, obtained my license, my first license in New York City, and then obtained licenses in Mississippi and Tennessee. During the time that I was teaching, I should say after I got my bachelor's degree, I worked for a few companies as a soils engineer. And then later on, after I left the State University of New York at Buffalo, I taught civil engineering subjects, including soil mechanics, foundation engineering, and forensic engineering. That was, I think, the first time that forensic engineering was taught in an undergraduate civil engineering program anywhere. But I worked as a consulting engineer from 1972 onward on my own at the University of Buffalo and at Mississippi State University. We had, as faculty, given time 1 day a week to do consulting work. So that sometimes also included like Saturdays and Sundays. And that's about it as far as my background in teaching and consulting.
Well, it's a pretty impressive background, and you've got experience as an associate editor of the Journal of Performance of Constructed Facilities. Please tell us about that experience.
Well, in that position, I reviewed papers submitted for publication to the Journal of Performance of Constructed Facilities, and I'll repeat, of the Technical Council on Forensic Engineering of the American Society of Civil Engineering, or ASCE. I was a member of the council since about 1982. I held various positions on the journal and the education committees. Initially, I was a reviewer for the journal and later promoted to associate editor for a number of years. In reviewing papers, I looked at things like how its content contributed to the state of the art, accuracy and comprehensiveness, and generally we welcomed case studies. But I reviewed different kinds of papers. Generally, I was given the job of reviewing papers in the geotechnical area, but sometimes it went out of the geotechnical area. I reviewed perhaps close to 100 papers during my period as a reviewer.
So you have experience looking at technical arguments, knowing what sounds good, what sounds bad. So, I mean, you've got a tremendous background to bring to this debate because, I mean, I imagine that you had to reject some bad arguments during your time doing that.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. It was probably, I'm just going to take a rough guess, out of 10 papers, maybe rejected about 6 or 7, and maybe past 3, and that was because it was not. Sometimes it was poorly written, and so I would give a review and indicate that if the persons that submitted the paper were willing to make the corrections that I required. And if they then resubmitted, I would review it But unfortunately, in some cases, it still did not cut the muster.
Now, you've got experience with forensic engineering. For our audience that may be new people listening to this program here, can you briefly tell our audience what forensic engineering constitutes?
Well, in my the way I put it, forensic engineering generally involves the investigation and the determination of the causes of failures of constructed facilities, as well as rendering opinions and giving testimony in judicial proceedings.
Coming to 9/11, for yourself personally, how did you get to know about this issue? What did you consider the strongest evidence to make you look at it again?
I went into YouTube a lot and looked at a lot of different YouTubes concerning the 9/11 situation. I would say perhaps hundreds of YouTube presentations, such as, for example, David Griffin. Is that his name? Are you familiar with David Griffin?
Yes, David Ray Griffin is the sort of the founding father.
Yeah, well, that man, was really on the money. That guy really hit the nail on the head. I really enjoyed listening to him because he was very thorough. So looking at presentations like Professor Griffin, I began to form a picture in my head as to what was going on. But like I said, I looked at different engineering presentations, people with PhDs. There was this man from Europe, and I wish I remember his name. I think it was Harrod, something like Harrod. He was primarily a chemical engineer. But if you listen to these different people, you started to formulate an idea that didn't make sense, didn't correlate with what's called the Nist Report. That's the government's report. There were a lot of inconsistencies in those reports. And, the idea that the two towers, the Tower 1 and 2 at World Trade Center, that they came down sort of like a pile driver, and that was not what I was seeing in comparing what was said by some of the engineering and science experts. So I started to, when I looked at things like, for example, what was found there after this destruction. For example, they found these meteor-like balls of concrete and steel and meshed into a ball. I couldn't see how that could be produced by pancaking. So I started to believe this idea that it was, that this thing took place as a result of explosions and the use of thermitic material. That made more sense. And then, for example, the work of Chandler, the physics teacher, his explanations were pretty clear. So I then started to agree with the idea that this was not the result of fire, a jet plane hitting the side of the building. One guy described it as a pencil going into a screen, like a door screen. It made more sense to see that this thing had to be done by something else. One of the things that impressed me was the video that shows the building coming down. The cascading material coming down as building 1 and 2 collapsed. you could see that the material was blown upward and sideways. And, they say that these were large beams and columns. Well, that cannot be done by just gravity alone. There has to be something else involved. So I finally concluded that the whole thing, building 1 to 7, was as a result of something different than what was described by the Nist report. I thought that the testimony given, or not the testimony, what these engineers Gross and Sunder offered as explanations, to me it didn't sound right. And I remember seeing a model prepared by Nist showing the way that the building came down was not the way that you saw it come down. In other words, it came down very smoothly, sort of like in one unit, like in a controlled demolition, where these fellows tried to prove the ridiculous theory that this was started by one column, and to me that was totally ridiculous.
Now, we're going to get to Roland's report on the presentation in just a moment, but to set the stage for it, I want to ask you, Dr. Rendon, you provided a lot of the support for getting this presentation to happen. Why did you decide to invite AE 9/11 Truth to present?
Well, it seems like, and I'm going to try to explain this as best as I can, it's what I've seen in watching these YouTube's presentations is that every so often the ASCE is mentioned, or members of ASCE are mentioned, and sometimes it appears as if it was the entire ASCE organization. I don't believe that. I think that if there were engineers involved from ASCE, that it was just a few individuals, but not ASCE as an organization. One of the main people involved in the Nist report, I guess in the engineering part, was a gentleman by the name of Gene Corley. I had known Gene Corley for many, many years. I believe he passed away about 2 years ago. And I know him to be an honest man. I had numerous conversations during meetings and things like that. And I felt he was a reputable individual. So sometimes it appears in these YouTubes and in some talks as if ASCE was involved with the Nist report as an organization, and I don't believe that at all. As I said, there may have been a few engineers involved, and then they said that they were ASCE members or they presented in some other way, but that it wasn't as an organization. Now, Sunder, the engineers that have given testimony on YouTube, that includes Mr. Sunder and Mr. Gross, they make a presentation that to me doesn't seem right, and I don't know if they are civil engineers, members of ASCE. So I have attended a number of meetings of the Technical Council. And on 2 occasions during the end of the meeting, usually, when they say, well, is there anything else that we want to include in the study or in the meeting report, on 2 occasions I stood up and I started to say, to ask that the group consider looking at ASCE's participation in order to, how would I put it, in order to make it clear that, ASE, first of all, ASE was not involved as a group, but was involved, but were individuals participated in the Nist Report. And so I thought it would be good for ASE to consider its own study, its own investigation of the 9/11 and provide its own report on 9/11 to clarify the fact that ASCE was not involved as an organization and give their own opinion of what happened there.
All right, so now just to be specific, where Roland presented was at the Mississippi-Alabama Engineering Society meeting. And we're going to switch over to Roland here because Roland is is the one that was speaking there, and he's going to be telling us about his experience there. So, Roland, talk about your presentation. First of all, what did you present? What facts? How did you lay it out?
I'd like to start out, first of all, by thanking Professor Rendon for arranging for us to speak there. And the reception that I got was very warm, very friendly. A lot of interest and good questions, and I was very pleased to have the opportunity to make the presentation. So I want to thank you personally, Professor Rendon. We've never met in person, but I do very much appreciate the effort that you made
welcome.
For this to come forward. And I know from what I've just heard about what you said that you're probably in a situation where you're kind of maybe feel like the lone voice in the room. Where ASCE has been put forward as the interpretation, at least, that's been given that they are solidly behind this Nist report. And I think you're questioning that interpretation, and I think that takes a lot of courage sometimes. So I appreciate your efforts. I really do. Thank you.
Yes.
So I got down there. Go ahead. You'd like to add something?
Yeah, I was just going to say I've been a member of ASCE since 1963, and all the people that I have known, I'm talking about a few hundred in the organization. I'm talking about on the technical council, for example. I have known them all to be, very reputable individuals and honest. Yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry.
That's quite all right. I feel the same way. I have been an engineer now registered in California for 50 years, and I've had a lot of contact with engineers, of course, over the years. And my impression of people that go into engineering is they're pretty much fact-based people. They enjoy the analysis of why things work. They enjoy finding out the truth of why things behave the way they do. They're not they're not salesmen. They're not trying to sell anything. They're trying to look at the reality and put aside their personal prejudices. And that's what I like about engineering, and that's what I like about engineers. And I felt that if we went down there and told a story as we know it, that we would get an interested reception. And I put it this way, I feel, and I felt personally, when the buildings collapsed on 9/11, that it was a direct challenge to our profession.
Yes.
Those were engineering failures. However you want to look at it, they were engineering failures. And coming to study what happened, they were actually engineering failures that occurred under design loads. The towers were designed to withstand a hit from an airliner, including airliners loaded with fuel. And Building 7 fell down, just according to the Nist report, just to basic office fires.
Yes.
So when you have a structure that fails under a design load, then there's something wrong. Your design load was wrong, or something else was at work. maybe something that wasn't your design load. So
Yes.
that's the point of interest that engineers come to. And I try to point out that we as engineers, as we study this problem, which is what it is, as we study this problem, we're trying to stay away from the more controversial political and economic factors that are related to this failure. As engineers, I don't think that's our job.
That's correct.
Our job is to point out what happened and why it happened. That's our job. Where it goes from there, that's somebody else's business. We can have our own opinions about it. We can have our own feelings about it, but that's not pertinent to our examination of the problem.
That's correct.
Engineers are not supposed to engage in any kind of emotional connection with what the problem they're studying, because that's going to color their perceptions, and that's going to detract from their objectivity, which is what they're striving for, science. Yes. So I began the discussion with the World Trade Center Towers 1 and 2, because I feel like that's the problem that most people are aware of. I did a little hand survey in the class, and about half the people that were there had some knowledge of the Building 7 collapse, but about half didn't. So I wanted to talk about the things that people were familiar with, and everyone in the world, of course, is familiar with the collapse of the towers on that day.
That's correct.
So I began with that story, and I went back into the construction of the buildings, their layout, the fact that they were considered to be the strongest high-rise towers ever built. They had a very high redundancy factor. The factor of safety was extremely strong based upon the design, which was essentially a tube within a tube.
Yes.
And the construction of the towers, of course, took into account the fact that most of the structural steel in the building was in the lower part of the building, because the lower part of the building had to hold up everything above it. So the columns,
that's correct,
as they went up, were tapered. And I had a visual that was provided to me by Richard Gage, and he provided all of the PowerPoint slides that I presented. And this particular slide, I think, was very effective because it showed a schematic of the buildings, of the towers 1 and 2, and it indicated the percentage of the steel that was located in each of the areas of the building. So it divided the building up into essentially 7 cubes from bottom to top.
Yes.
And it also showed, of course, there were 6 basement floors. And it divided up the steel in the building according to how much of the steel was in each of those cubes. So at the bottom cube, you had almost 30% of the steel. Whereas at the top cube, you only had a little more than 1% of the steel. Now the planes hit in the area of the top 2 cubes. The World Trade Center 2, the plane hit about 85th floor, so that was like halfway down the second cube. So that being the case, if we consider the plane impact zones and we look at the division of the building then into 2 solid structures, the area above the impact zone and the area below the impact zone. The area above the impact zone had maybe at most 4% of the steel of the building in it, whereas the area below the impact zone had like 96% of the steel. So my appeal to the engineers was, we're going to talk about this in a little more detail, but when you look at that, most engineers that I know that have been practicing for a while, they have a pretty good feel for things. And
yes,
if you look at that model and you say, all right, you got the impact zone here, you got 1.5% of the steel above the impact zone, you got 4.5% above, 96 below. Do you think that the impact and the fires weakening the columns in the impact zone are going to cause that cube above to fall on the bottom structure and cause it to completely collapse to the ground? Does that sound reasonable to you?
Absolutely not.
And I don't think there's an engineer in that building that thought that was a possibility.
Yeah.
I said, but that is the explanation. That is the still official explanation of why this building collapsed. So let's take a look at the derivation of that theory and its evolution, and let's see how that theory came about and how it's been developed over time. Now, that theory was put forward by Professor Besant of Northwestern University 2 days after the attacks. He submitted his paper to the ASCE Journal of Engineering Mechanics. I presume that they vetted that theory. They thought that it was valid, and it's plausible on its face. In other words, the progressive collapse theory is one explanation that bears looking at, and there's nothing wrong with looking at, and there's nothing wrong with what they did. They published the theory in January of 2002, and then there were some questions raised about the theory. And this is the process that a lot of people that aren't involved in technology or scientific pursuit, they don't necessarily understand this process. The peer review, the publishing of papers, the questions about the papers, the discussion that follows, the resolution of the dispute, and so on and so forth. A lot of people don't understand that, but it is a very precise process that's been developed over many hundreds of years to help scientists, technical people, and engineers come to a conclusion about what actually happened. And that's the process that ASCE began when they published their article in January of 2002. Why did the World Trade Center collapse? Simple analysis. And it was published under the name of Professor Besant and one of his graduate students, Mr. Zhu. So over time, questions were raised. And then Nist published their report about the tower collapses in 2005, and then a couple of years later about Building 7. And this discussion was going around in the engineering community and in the popular press. But by 2008, these questions were serious enough where Besant and ASCE felt that they would address them. And so they published another paper. Besant wrote a paper called What Did and Did Not Cause Collapse of World Trade Center Twin Towers in New York. And the Journal of Engineering Mechanics published that in their October of 2008 edition. So that in turn led to further discussion, and a couple of more papers were published shortly thereafter. A paper by McQueen and Zambodi was published called The Missing Jolt, A Simple Refutation of the Nist-Besant Collapse Hypothesis. That was published in the Journal of 9/11 Studies online in 2009. And then David Chandler, the physics teacher, published his paper, Destruction of the World Trade Center North Tower and Fundamental Physics, on the website Journal of 9/11 Studies in the year 2010. So then Besant and Lee came back, and another author by the name of Lee. He defended the theory again in a paper that they called Why the Observed Motion History of the World Trade Center Towers is Smooth. And that was published in the ASCE Journal, Journal of Engineering Mechanics, in January of 2011. So he was responding. So this discussion was going on. Even though ASCE would not publish the questions that were raised, Besant and ASCE felt that they had to respond because the questions were being raised on the internet. And Besant actually referred to them in kind of a disparaging manner, as that these weren't real experts. They were outside the sphere of professional discussion, and that was kind of a derogatory dig at them. But nevertheless, they considered what had been said, and they were defending it. And then Zamboti and Johns again submitted a discussion paper regarding why the observed motion history of the World Trade Centers was smooth, and that was published in May of 2011. But, that was submitted in May of 2011, but it wasn't published by ASCE. And a year later, Zamboti and Johns were notified by the Journal of Engineering Mechanics editors that their discussion paper had been rejected on the basis of one reviewer's comments. So when they saw the comments, they responded to the rejection with a rebuttal, showing the rejection was wrong on almost all points. And the Journal of Engineering Mechanics editors responded by agreeing to publish the discussion paper after an editorial review. So here we see the scientific process taking place. There's questions. There's back and forth. There's give and take. There's addressing questions with other answers, and so on and so forth. This is the process. But then another year passed with no action on the part of the Journal of Engineering Mechanics editors, and Zamboti and Johns sent a letter to them in May of 2013 asking as to the status of their discussion paper. And in June of that year, they published another article, Some Misunderstandings Related to the World Trade Center Analysis, in the International Journal of Protective Structures. And in August of 2013, the Journal of Engineering Mechanics chief editors William Casper Willem and Roberto Ballerini responded that their discussion paper that they had submitted to the Journal of Engineering Mechanics was, quote, out of scope, end quote, and would not be published in the Journal of Engineering Mechanics. So in other words, they closed off the debate. They closed off the debate saying that they were not going to respond to a discussion paper that they had already agreed that they would publish. And this was now almost 4 years ago. And since then, they have refused to publish anything in regard to this ongoing questioning of the progressive collapse theory. So there's been a disruption of the scientific process here, and that is one of the things that we are concerned about, and one of the things that we are trying to raise in the engineering community, because we feel that if engineers like yourself point out that this process has not been carried through in the rigorous fashion that it should, then it should be. This discussion should be continued, and they should not be telling people that have legitimate questions that their questions are out of scope. This is too important a question to disrupt the scientific process. So then I went on and I talked about the evolution of the progressive collapse theory, mathematical model. You know, Lord Kelvin said that you don't really begin to understand things until you can put them into numbers. And that's, of course, what engineers strive to do. They strive to construct accurate mathematical models of what occurs in such a way that they can then predict future behavior based upon those models. That's exactly what engineering is all about. So Besant used an energy analysis to construct his progressive collapse theory. He basically said that the gravitational energy of the tower above the impact zone added to the energy of the impact when the upper part of the building fell onto the lower part of the building was greater than the resistance of the columns that failed in the impact zone added to the resistance of the structure in the lower part of the building below the impact zone. It's a very straightforward theory. In other words, you've got weight above the impact zone, it falls down, hits the lower zone, and the resistance of the columns that were resisting that falling added to the resistance of the structure below were what opposed it. And he's saying that the first two forces were significantly greater than the latter two forces, and that's why the buildings fell down. So there's nothing wrong with that theory. We don't have any argument with it. You can say it as E1 plus E2 is greater than E3 plus E4. That's the theory. That's the mathematical model. We'll follow that and see where it goes. What we found, and this was done by a number of researchers, The estimation, when you look at the numbers that were plugged into that theory, we found that the estimation of the weight of the upper part of the building was too high because he used the design load. Well, the design load is the maximum load that the structure will see during its lifetime at any time. And it certainly didn't have a design load on the day that it fell down. In fact, the working load is always significantly less than the design load. And in this case, by using the design load instead of the working load, which can be pretty accurately estimated, he had an estimation of that weight that was about twice what it really should have been. Secondly, his estimation of the kinetic energy was quadruple what it should have been, because he used a free fall velocity of the upper section onto the lower section. And we know from measurement of the video that it wasn't free fall. It was only about 3/4 of free fall. And because that kinetic energy is related to the square of the velocity of impact, that winds up being way too high. So his first two estimates were way too high. His second estimate is the third problem that he had was that one of the problems that was related to that was that he discounted the resistance of the columns in the impact zone entirely, as if they didn't exist. But there were 248 columns there. And a very low percentage of those columns had been damaged by the aircraft itself. And of course, some of the others had been weakened by the fires. But to say that they actually ceased to exist, that's way off. And then his estimation of the resistance of the columns in the lower part of the building was too low by a factor of nearly 3, and that's because he didn't take into account the tapering factor that occurred as the building went up in height. So when you correct his input data into his equation, and you find out that E1 was too high, E2 was too high, E3 was too low, and E4 was too low, the inequality turns around, and it turns out that the progressive collapse will not occur. So we have taken the official explanation, we've checked it against the actual conditions, and we have found that the theory does not work. The building will not fall down according to that mathematical model. And there's nothing wrong with the mathematical model at all. The only problem is with the input data, which can, of course, change the outcome into its opposite, and that's what happened. So I explained that to the engineers at the conference, and I really don't think that there's an engineer there that wasn't convinced that this process somehow was violated. When we submit information that indicates that there are errors in a theory of whatever nature, that position deserves to be heard in the engineering community, so that people can make their own analysis, and they can follow the logic, and they can see which side they're on. In this particular case, you get two different analyses. And so that was my major point that I wanted to make to the engineering community, that the existing theory, the progressive collapse theory, does not work when you put in the actual data for the theory that has been put forward. It will not work. It does not work. And furthermore, Professor Bazant and the ASCE refused to discuss that conclusion. That is a major, major problem for the civil engineering and the engineering community in general, because the scientific process has been violated. So then I went into the reason. Go ahead.
Yeah.
Would you like to respond?
Okay. Yeah. I believe that when that thing started to collapse at the top, that all of that stuff above the point where you have those 20 stories, all that stuff basically vaporized. It just crumbled. So what was falling was not a unit, but was debris. That's one thing. But the one thing I want to voice my own opinion about is that let me just give you a little background on the way that the different committees, the different committees that, the different committees at ASCE, the way they operate. You have an editor. In our case, it was Kenneth Carper, who was a very, very honest man. I think very highly of him. But the way it worked was that the editor would receive the paper that was submitted. Actually, it first went through ASCE's general office, and you could tell right off the bat if a paper was worth continuing to be reviewed or not. Then it went to the editor, and in this case, it was Ken Carper. And Ken Carper would look at the paper, and if it had to do with, let's say, hydraulics, it would go to a committee. It would go to a group of people in ASCE, in ASCE, that were hydraulics people. If it was geotechnical, it would probably come to me, and things like that. So usually they pick two people to review the paper, and in some cases, where there was some problem, and the author would complain that the paper wasn't submitted, wasn't reviewed correctly, or something like that. In some cases, they would ask a third person to look at it. Okay, so when the whole thing was finalized, it was based on the editor's input, and the two reviewers in general. Now, that wouldn't go throughout the whole organization of ASCE. It would just be those three people. In the case of engineering mechanics, that is another committee, and it operates basically the same way. Now, the engineer mechanics group would not submit the paper up for, let's say, a whole bunch of people in ASCE to review it. It was usually three people involved. So if it was the same individuals in the engineering mechanics division, I would not say that this was a decision made by ASCE. It was made by that particular committee and probably those individuals. Now, if those same individuals were involved throughout the process of review, then I would. That's something that I would like to look into. But I would not go as far as to say that it was ASCE that was doing this. In my case, when I brought it to attention during two important meetings, it was by people basically got upset, and I basically had to shut up. But I don't know the reason that they were behaving that way. But that's probably because they may believe that architects and engineers for truth, are conspiracy theorists or whatever. But I just wanted to make that make that qualifications that when the engineering mechanics group rejected the papers or put a stop on it or something like that, that it was not all of the, ASCE is a big organization. So that's one of the reasons I want to do this. I want ASCE to get involved in doing a study of this to correct these views of the society. And that was just what I wanted to. That was my input.
I appreciate that. I get the mechanism that's going on.
Yeah.
And I feel the same way. I feel that somehow a small minority within the profession has cast an improper and untrue characterization on the buildings and what happened that day. And I
agree.
I feel like we're having a hard time having a discussion, because as soon as we try to have that discussion, instead of discussing the facts that we have uncovered and the evidence that we've unearthed, we get called conspiracy theorists and told that we're outside the engineering community. And that's, I
agree.
That's very harmful. That's very harmful to our whole profession.
Now, I think something that is going to probably be a big game changer, at least in discussion of this among people in the professional community, is the upcoming World Trade Center 7 study that's going to be coming out in August. We've been talking about that for a long time here, and Dr. Rendon, you're going to be a reviewer for the report.
That's correct.
What will you be looking for based on your experience as an associate editor of the Journal of Performance in Constructed Facilities when you review for the study?
Okay, that's a very good question. Well, one of the things is that, in my work as a forensic engineer, when I get outside my expertise, I will usually hire a person that has the expertise to handle a particular question, and then I include that person's report in an appendix with my report, and then I indicate the conclusions that this other person reached with regard to this thing. So looking just at over the surface of Professor Hulsey's report, which is called Progress on Evaluation of World Trade Center 7 Collapse, I may recommend that experts in certain areas be included. I would be looking at things in which I have expertise. I'll be looking at the what are the specific useful contributions of this report to Architects and Engineers for Truth. So I have already noticed in a brief look at this 47 page report that we're going to have to include other people that have expertise outside my area.
Now, Roland, I want to get an idea of what was the reaction when you presented at this meeting.
I left room for some questions at the end. Unfortunately, I had to run off and catch a plane in Florida within.
Well, I could say something here.
Okay.
I talked to the lady at Mississippi Engineering Society's office. She's sort of like the person that runs it, the organization, and she said the reception was very good, very, very, yeah. So I was impressed by that,
I was too.
So,
that was my impression. Of course,
yeah.
Everybody's subjective about what they do themselves. So you'd like to think that everything you did was great. I tried to be objective about it, but I did get a long, sustained, and loud applause when I was done.
That's great. Yeah.
And there were a couple of engineers that came up to me afterward, very supportive. One of them wanted me to contact the place where he was the director emeritus. His name was Dr. Whalen. You may know him.
Yes, I do.
He thought that we should try to make a presentation in front of the Engineers Design and Research Group in Vicksburg. He subsequently followed up for me, but got back to me and said that they have to be funded in order to do a study. And they didn't have any funding, so that's why they weren't involved.
Well, guys, I hate to jump in because we're having such a lively discussion right now, but we are actually out of time for this broadcast. We're going to need to pick it up. I hope we can get both of you back on the show to pick up a good discussion. I don't think you guys even need me. I think you guys can host this yourselves. Okay. You're doing a great job. But good job, Roland, doing the presentation. Hopefully we're going to have many more coming our way. But again, thank you for coming on 9/11 Freefall.
Okay,
well,
thank you.
For having us.
I appreciate it.
This program is on every Thursday night on No Lies Radio at 10 o'clock Eastern, 7 o'clock Pacific. You can also keep track of the archives by going to 911freefall.com. This is Andy Steele saying have a great week and good luck.